Okay. Hi, everybody. It's great to have you here. My name is Brad. I'm from Vancouver on the west coast of Canada. I'm a grad student at one of the universities here, and I've been active with system change, not climate change, for 3 or 4 years now. We're here today with Angus to discuss his new book, Facing the Anthropocene, Fossil Fuel Capitalism and the Crisis of the Earth System. So to introduce Ian and Angus, and to say a little bit about System Change, Not Climate Change, the organization that's sponsoring this interview, I just want to start with a passage that I just reheard in the last hour while preparing for this. It's a few moments from a speech that Angus gave at a conference a few years ago, and I think it describes what it gives you a sense of the character of Ian and a sense of why System Change, Not Climate Change as a network needs to exist. So here he goes. Emissions are not slowing down, they're speeding up, and the world is speeding into a climate hell. What's worse is a climate crisis is only one of the 9 planetary boundaries that we have trouble with. Even if by some miracle greenhouse gas emissions were reduced to 0 tomorrow, first we're going to head towards global warming anyhow. Nobody is even working on the other planetary boundaries. What humanity is facing in this century is not only the deterioration of conditions of life in one area or even one country as a characteristic of the environmental problems of the last decades. The metabolic rift is now global, and there is now a very real possibility that it will throw all of humanity into a new dark age, and that all our dreams for a better world will be replaced by unending nightmares. After a pause for a few seconds, Ian goes on, that's not an exaggeration. Continues, most socialists and socialist groups would agree to what I have said so far. Capitalism is destroying the earth and socialism is the solution. And yet, says Angus, when I compare the socialist literature on environmental crisis with the actual socialist response globally and nationally, I'm struck by the continued gap between theory and practice. Now, I have many shelves of books and Marxist books on the environmental crisis, says Angus. Many do a very good job of describing the crisis and identifying capitalism as the problem and socialism as the solution. None links the processes together, however, or discusses how to build a movement that faces these problems squarely. It's almost as though, says Angus, Karl Marx had written, philosophers have only interpreted the world and what the heck, that's enough. And then he quotes, just to finish off here, he quotes system change activist Nick Davenport. Socialists have tended to treat the environmental crisis as a stick to beat capitalism with, and as another proof that capitalism has to go, but not as an arena of class struggle in which they must be fully committed. So this describes the potential of system change, not climate change, building a network to reconcile the gulf that Ian Angus points to between theory and practice. So I would urge all of you, if you're interested in keeping in touch with the kind of people who are part of this network, and if you're interested in sharing strategies, ecosocialist strategies, and getting active and connecting theory and practice to find a way to get involved in system change, not climate change. And one quick way to do that is to send an email to info@systemchangenotclimatechange.org. So please go ahead and do that, and we'll get you on some lists and we'll get you involved. So now for the interview. This is an interview about Ian Angus and his new book, Facing the Anthropocene, Fossil Capitalism and the Crisis of Earth Systems. And I've got a series of questions here to start out, and we'll go for the next half hour or so, and then the rest of you out there will have a chance to ask a few questions. So the first question from me, after reading the book, I was quite surprised at the depth that Ian Angus went into in reviewing the science of the Anthropocene, and it seemed to me that you were trying to pay respect to the physical scientists in advance and pay respect to their understanding of the complexity of the Earth system. and their struggle to register what is happening lately within the scientific community and the significance of the new era. Can you explain the concept of the Anthropocene and the importance of understanding the current climate crisis?
Well, I'll try. That's, of course, what the book is about. Let me start off by saying that the book does start out. The book is really divided into three parts. The first section, as you say, is on the science. The second on what are the causes, the social and economic and political causes of the crisis. And the third is some ideas about how to deal with it. And the importance of beginning with the science, I think, was apparent to me from the beginning. There's quite a few books on the Anthropocene, to put the case mildly. But I'm struck by how many of them are either hard science books, which mostly political people tend not to read, or political books with almost no science in them. There's sort of assumption at the beginning that people know what the Anthropocene is, or a simple definition of it. And the Anthropocene is actually a very complex topic, and it really, if you don't understand the science, it's very difficult to move on from the science to what is to be done. But insofar as I can say it shortly, Anthropocene or Anthropocene, both are used, both pronunciations, is a proposed name for what Earth system scientists view as a new epoch in humanity's relationship with Earth, or actually a new epoch in Earth history. Geologists divide the history of the entire Earth into periods and ages and epochs and so on. We are currently in the Holocene epoch, which has been around since the last ice age, about 12,000 years. And it's been a period of relatively stable climate, relatively stable conditions in almost all terms. That doesn't mean there hasn't been, obviously, earthquakes and hurricanes and all that sort of thing. But compared with, say, the period of the ice age, when the climate just varied enormously over very short periods of time, you had huge swings of average temperatures for something like 800,000 years. For the 12,000 years we've had since the ice last retreated, we've had remarkably stable conditions. And what scientists started to discover, really beginning in the late 1980s and above all in the 1990s, was that at some point in the not too distant past, and remember these are geologists, so they might be talking thousands of years or centuries, but at some point in the not too distant past, the conditions of the Holocene had suddenly shifted. That is that all of the key systems that can be seen in how the Holocene functioned, and that includes climate, but it also includes the whole carbon cycle, it includes the nitrogen cycle, it includes biodiversity, many other things that sort of characterize the Holocene. In a whole range of those areas, variation had now gone outside of the range of the past 12,000 years. We were now seeing exceedingly extreme change taking place. And those changes overwhelmingly were driven by human activity. That what we have seen is as one famous paper in this field said, is that we have entered a period in which human activity is actually overwhelming the great geological and other forces of nature that have driven the Earth's climate and other conditions on Earth for thousands and thousands of years. So the Anthropocene is a proposed name for this new epoch, global warming being the phenomenon we all know about most and all hear about, not most, but there are many of them. And there is great debate about exactly when the change took place, and we can talk about that. But that's fundamentally what it's at. And it was not just, some of the articles you'll read, you'd think that some scientist one day had the idea, let's have a new name. But in fact, it's the product of what was in practice the largest international cooperation activity that there ever has been, the International Geosphere Biosphere Program that began about 1990 and involved well over 10,000 scientists worldwide studying the history of Earth in order to see what has changed. You had to figure out what it has been in the past. And there has been an extraordinary expansion in our knowledge of how the Earth system works. And that's where the Anthropocene grows from.
Okay, thanks. You follow a few scientists in particular, and namely a couple of them are Paul Crutzen, if I have the pronunciation right, and Will Steffen. Can you tell us what they mean that is in a non-analog state?
Okay, well, both Crutzen was a Nobel Prize winner. He won the Nobel Prize for his work in identifying the helping to identify the problems and the danger to the ozone layer. Will Steffen is an internationally known climate scientist, originally based in Australia, and they became leading figures in the International Geosphere Biosphere Program. And in essence, in the year 2000, when the IGBP had been going now for something over a decade, they had a big conference in order to discuss, to summarize the research, to bring it all together. And that's where Crutzen at that meeting and actually came up with the term Anthropocene to describe this new epoch they were seeing. And what they were saying, and it comes out again and again in their work, is that we have entered what they use the term a no analog state, or sometimes simply terra incognita. That is, when we now have a pretty good picture of the state of our planet for the past certainly 800,000 years, what the climate was like, how things evolved over that period of time, and what they are saying is that the changes that have taken place recently, and they're now saying in the past 50 to 60 years, are unparalleled. There simply has not been a period in which there have been such big changes so quickly as we are seeing right now, in our lifetimes. So when they say no analog state, they are saying this is a unique experience. And part of what they're saying is we have some idea of where this may take us because we know some things. But in fact, because there's never been a period like this, we haven't got a past to compare it to. We can work on what has happened in the past and say things like that might happen, how fast changes might take place, for example. But we are moving into the unknown in terms of Earth's history, and certainly in terms of anything that has existed during the 160,000 years that there have been human beings on the planet.
It seems that a lot of the analysis and description of climate change has been about gradual shifts. This is what you read in a lot of the IPCC reports. And it seems in the last couple of years in particular, a lot of the discussion among the scientists, particularly among a few of them, has just shifted more towards analyzing this issue of abrupt climate change and amplified positive feedbacks. Can you explain what the difference is between the gradual shift and abrupt climate change, and talk about the historical precedents for massive and rapid and very quick changes to the Earth systems?
Well, again, we have to go back, say, to the 1980s and what scientists knew about our history. We knew that there have been periods in the past of our planet when areas that are now tropical had been covered with ice or vice versa. We know that temperatures have been higher or lower than they are now. But it had always been assumed that such changes would take thousands of years to carry through. That is, there would be very long-term gradual shifts from one state to another. During the 1990s and into the past, into the 2000s, science has increasingly been studying what actually happened, mostly doing by drilling very, very deep cores in Greenland and then in Antarctica. You can tell by the gases that are embedded in snow that fell hundreds of thousands of years ago. You can determine what the conditions were and how rapidly things changed. And it was quite a shock to many of the scientists involved to realize that there were periods in which the average temperature shifted over a decade, in which in a few years you'd suddenly go from very warm to cold. If you look at the period when the ice ages ended, there was a period of where everything got warmer for a while, and there was a sudden rapid drop that is still somewhat mysterious, and then that was followed by a sudden rapid increase in temperature. It appears, as one climate scientist said, he said that the climate is an ornery beast that overreacts to even the smallest nudge. That it takes that even quite a small shift in the underlying conditions can trigger very large shifts in the overall state of the Earth. And that's particularly true in climate. One of the characteristics of the Ice Age is where substantially wide swings in the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. You get into the Holocene, the time we are, it was all very stable for an extended period. And when you look again at the Ice Age, the relationship between those shifts in CO2 and the overall temperature of the world was very, very tight. It became apparent that carbon dioxide is the thermostat of the Earth's climate. And what we have seen now in the past century is an increase that is faster than has ever occurred. Our current level of CO2 is not just way higher than it has ever been as long as human beings have been on the Earth, but it is also increasing much more rapidly than any time we can find since about 55 million years ago. So you put those things together and the potential for a quite sudden state shift becomes possible. And scientists have been studying that, but also abrupt change in other things. For example, biodiversity very likely will hit certain, there can be points at which there's a sudden and rapid decrease in biodiversity resulting after periods of very slow change. Similarly, the nitrogen cycle, which has a huge impact on life in the water, we don't actually know. We don't have any previous experience of the nitrogen level getting as high as it is today. So all of these things could trigger quite rapid shifts. I'm not saying, remember the movies that showed suddenly the entire ocean freezes and ice comes down the streets of New York. We're not talking about that kind of speed. We are talking about decades rather than centuries or millennia.
Great. We just have 10-15 minutes before the questions start, so I want to squeeze in a few questions now, shifting a little bit to the social science. The first one is we had a little discussion earlier, Ian, about your interaction with the research subjects for the book, the scientists themselves. And you spoke with great respect about your discussions with them, about the depth of their knowledge, and also about their sophistication in terms of the socioeconomic roots of the crisis and the solutions to the crisis being very deeply, finding those is you have to go deeply into the social science. You mentioned in the book that Will Steffen used the term great acceleration, and you mentioned that this was an allusion to Karl Polanyi's famous term, the great transformation. So here you see a sort of hints of scientists going past, what we typically think of with a lot of the environmentalism out there as being this connection to market solutions and sort of mainstream environmentalism. But my sense from you is that there's some very deep thinkers in terms of the deep social origins of the problem. Can you explain, maybe by referring to what the Great Acceleration is after World War II and what the allusion to Great Transformation was all about?
Well, the Great Acceleration, that came out of research that, again, the IGBP, the International Geosphere Biosphere Program, did. When they were doing their big synthesis report, they decided it would be useful to assemble statistics. They had concluded that the world had started to change somewhere around the time of the Industrial Revolution, so could we document that? And they produced a whole set of statistics and then turned them into graphs, everything from carbon dioxide to number of cars, that kind of thing. And they certainly did see an increase starting with the Industrial Revolution, but the thing they noticed when they graphed them all is how many of these graphs, in fact virtually all of them, suddenly turned upwards very, very rapidly, somewhere around 1945 or 1950. So there's a sudden period after World War II in which humanity's impact on the planet accelerated, just took off. And those graphs have been updated since, and they continue to go to reach the point of being almost asymptotic, almost going straight up in terms of the amount of change and the speed of change. And Steffen and a couple of others, including John McNeill, the author of Nothing New Under the Sun, came up with the name, the Great Acceleration, for this, to describe a radical shift in human planetary history. That suddenly a whole set of trends that had been slowly increasing over centuries suddenly took off in the mid-20th century. And the Great Acceleration, as you said, was closely related to Polanyi's concept of a period in which suddenly economic and social systems changed. and you had a very rapid shift in the way the world functioned. What I found dealing with the scientists and working with them, I mean, the range of political views is just what you would expect to see in society. I know eco-socialists who are dedicated Earth system scientists, and I know conservatives who are. But what I do see is a determination to try and find ways to solve this, solve the problems we're facing. After Stefan stepped down as head of the IGBP, he went to Australia and he became head of the Climate Commission there, which was the government body, or at least a member of the Climate Commission, the government body that was charged with advising the government of the time on what to do about climate change. And he wrote their major report, and it was so radical that the government dissolved the commission. And if you try and find their website, it's gone. I mean, it very explicitly said one of the things that we need to do is leave the fossil fuels in the ground. Which in Australia, which is a country big on coal, that was a pretty radical suggestion. So we see this right across the board. That's not to say that there's a huge level of radical thought among the scientists. We see people trying to work it out. Kevin Anderson and Alice Bowes-Larkin, who are probably the two top British climate scientists, have taken quite radical position in favor of that we must in fact slow economic growth and virtually stop it in order to achieve even the 2-degree increase. Again, this has brought a lot of conservative criticism on them, but they are out of the science coming to radical social conclusions.
Okay. One of the conversations out there, especially among eco-socialists who work in this area, is this discussion, and you've referred to it in some recent debates online with scholars and published it on Climate Capitalism. This issue of the term the Anthropocene versus the term the Capitalocene. Can you explain why many leftists reject this term Anthropocene in favor of this connotation of needing a word to reflect the idea that it isn't common humanity that is what the problem is, but the capitalist class or capitalism as a system? Could you just chat about that, please?
Well, of course, I'm obviously as a socialist, I'm very sympathetic to the view that capitalism is responsible for the crisis we face. And perhaps if we'd had some eco-socialists there sitting beside Paul Crutzen when he came up with the word back in 2000, we might have persuaded him to come up with a different word. My response to that argument is very simply, yes, I see the point. However, arguing about the name is the wrong thing to discuss. Here we've got some of the top scientists in the world coming to radical conclusions, saying things that only the most left-wing of environmentalists would say 20 years ago, and they're producing the science to support it. And it seems to me completely absurd for the left to then say, well, let's fight, let's put all that aside and argue about the word. I just think that's the wrong place to be, the wrong debate to be having. In any event, the word Anthropocene is pretty much accepted now. It's there, and we as the left aren't going to change it. Now, having said that, there is actually another argument, and this is one of the problems with word, same word meaning two different things. There is a whole argument that says we shouldn't be talking about this Anthropocene stuff at all. We should be talking about the history of capitalism. And there's an argument that comes out that uses the term Capitalocene, but by that means the whole history of capitalism, not the current crisis of the Earth system we're facing. I think it's confusing to use the words, to have that word used in two quite different meanings. The other thing I would add, by the way, is that if you go, the assumption that because it has the word anthropos, meaning people, is the root word of Anthropocene, that the scientists are saying all humans are responsible. Actually, it's very hard to find anything like that in any of the scientific literature, and the people who say it's a problem don't seem to have any quotes that I can find. They're just assuming this is a problem. If you go back to Paul Crutzen's very first peer-reviewed paper on the Anthropocene, which he published in 2002, in it he says that this is a problem caused by 25% of the world's population, not all humans. Now, you can argue about 25%. I think he's rather overstated it there. But the fact is it's very clear that he was not making a sort of general statement about humanity, but was talking about specifically the impact of the richest part of the world.
Okay, so here's a last question for my questions to you. and perhaps Steve Willett, who organized the session, if he can, after this question, open the mic up. And again, we have both online callers and phone callers, and hopefully there'll be an open line to both of those groups. We'll see how it works out in a few minutes. So my last question to you for now is about social change. Can you tell us a little bit about your views on social change? Ecosocialists have always gone a long way to distinguish their program from liberal environmentalism and this market solutions imminent to capitalism that comes along with it. In the book, you seem to agree, and you actually quote Naomi Klein, who says that changing everything needs everyone. Do we need an environmental movement, or do we need a revolutionary socialist revolution? What role do eco-socialists have to play in the wider social justice, climate justice movement?
Well, first of all, I'd say I think that's a false dichotomy. The reality is we face, first of all, we face immediate problems, and as socialists, we're certainly aware that we're a minority. In fact, a quite tiny minority. We are not going to change the world tomorrow. So there is a need, if we were in a position to declare global socialism tomorrow, then we wouldn't have to talk about strategy or tactics or think about even organizing an organization. We'd just do it. But we are not in such a position, and that's not likely to happen in the near future. So I think there's two things we have to address. One of them is how do we how can we contribute to preventing catastrophe? And the other thing that's related to that is how can we build a movement to ensure that catastrophe doesn't recur? And on the first level, I think as eco-socialists, what we see ourselves, or I see my role as, is being the radical wing of a broader movement for social justice, for climate justice, for social justice generally. And we put a particular stress on the what are called the environmental issues, but we don't see it as separate from those other campaigns. And one of the things that I think Naomi Klein gets right is the idea that that the whole climate issue links into just about every other kinds of struggle you can think of. So that's so number one, that's where we have to be focused. I don't see our goal as to build some kind of if you've ever been to a demonstration, you've seen the people who stand on the sidelines. We're more revolutionary than everybody else here, and if you don't agree with what it says on our leaflet or our sign, then you're a reactionary and we'll have nothing to do with you. On the contrary, what we want to do is build the broadest movements we can with people who agree with as much as we can. We will work with people who with all kinds of views. Now, within that context, I think that's how you build a broader movement for broad social change, because it's through those kinds of campaigns that people will learn, that people come to understand how the system works, that people will gain confidence that they can change things. As you know, one of the biggest problems is people simply believe it's impossible to change the system. It's been attributed to several people, the comment that we live in a world in which it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. So giving people that confidence that the world can be changed is important. So I don't think those are two separate processes. I think they're together. And in fact, I think if eco-socialists sort of stand aside and just sort of declare themselves Simon Pure, we are the answer, well, we'll be standing there an awfully long time. We have to be part of the actual struggles that are going on today, contributing to them in the ways we know how, and talking to people about our ideas in that process.
Good answer. That sounds good. Good to me. Okay, so let's experiment here. We had a little bit of a problem last time we did this when we interviewed someone from the Goddard Institute at Nassau, that the phone callers weren't able to call in. So hopefully, Steve, you're in the background there, and you're going to open up and non-mute people. If people can try and contribute in an orderly way, that would be great. The other way of asking questions is for the people who are online. And I can see that there's quite a few people online. There's a way to type in a message, and if I see your message there, I'll pipe up and read the question for you. Okay, so I'll try and keep a a list here. So go ahead.
Ian, this is Steve. Can I just say that it appears that a lot of people who are online have not connected to the audio. At least they don't have a microphone next to their name, implying they have no way to speak to the meeting. So that may be part of the problem. And the other thing I would just offer is that people who are not speaking should mute themselves if they can, either with their phone if they're on the phone, or on the computer if they're on the computer, by clicking on the little microphone next to their name.
Brad, I can't hear you.
Yeah, I just put a message out to the people online again to please type some questions in. And before that happens, let me start with another one here. Can you tell us a little bit about, there's been a lot of discussion out there about the emotions that climate scientists are feeling and expressing because they come face to face with the realities and implications of their research. In your research for this book and talking about issues in a sort of in an analytical and rational way, what was your sense from the scientists in terms of their thoughts about the urgency and the impending crisis that are happening? What's the feeling out there amongst the scientists you talk to?
Once again, I think you'd see a fairly broad spectrum. The scientists who played the key role in developing Anthropocene science, by and large, see us facing a major crisis. The whole concept, for example, of planetary boundaries involves identifying not just climate change, but other planetary processes that have to be kept in control if we want to maintain the conditions, or as close to the conditions of the Holocene as we can. And while there are certainly people, there are some who are almost in a state of panic. There's a certain sense of it's catastrophic, and but what I see more commonly is a determination to try and get the message out. Most of them do not see themselves as authorities on economics or political science. I think from talking to some of them, I think they are more than they think they are, but there's a tendency to assume that they have their level of expertise, and their task is to get the science out so that other people can actually have political and economic power can act. But there is certainly a very strong sense of urgency. Most of the leading scientists in the world, for example, now feel that, at least in my experience, feel that the 1.5 degree goal just isn't achievable without some kind of magic, and even 2 degrees is going to be very, very difficult. So the idea that we have to actually get something done in the next, it's not just that governments love to do things like, here's our goal for 2050, which for a politician is perfect because they won't be in office then. The big thing you hear again and again from scientists is it's not, we do have to set long-term goals, but the big thing we have to do is get started now. Because, well, in terms of global warming, CO2 that's going into the atmosphere now isn't just warming now, it'll be warming the world for the next 1,000 years. CO2 doesn't come out very easily.
Okay, I have a question here from Michael Lebowitz. And here's his question. Why it matters so much, especially for ecosocialists, when the Anthropocene actually began, whether it was the agricultural revolution, the industrial revolution, or World War II?
Well, in a certain sense, of course, it doesn't matter. There's a certain level at which this is a debate among highly specialized people, and it's not essential for us to deal with. However, there's another sense in which it is. And that is those people who argue for that the Anthropocene began in the agricultural revolution, for example, are in essence arguing that nothing much has changed, that we have had, 6,000 years of the Anthropocene and we are not in a new circumstance. Whereas, as Jim Hansen puts it very well, he says, okay, if you want to say that the Anthropocene began, in 8,000 BC, that's fine, but then you're going to have to account for what is very clearly a hyper-Anthropocene that started about 1945 that is actually radically changing the world, the way the world functions. And typically, the scientists who argue for very long ago dates tend to be the more conservative ones, the ones who think that we don't need rapid action because we've been doing this all along. Humans have always changed the world, humans always will change the world. The argument for a more recent Anthropocene, which is actually the majority view in the Anthropocene Working Group now, is an argument that we are now in a radically new circumstance, not just humans affecting the world, but humans actually changing the way the Earth system works. And that has to be confronted quickly. So that's the argument there. The specific dates, we could go on forever, and scientists have looked at all kinds of them. The critical point here is that we are now in a radically different state of the world than we were in 50 or 100 years ago. And as socialists, that means that we have to start thinking about socialism broadly. That the kind of world we will confront in changing capitalism and in building a new society is not the one we might have expected 50 years ago. It is going to be different. And we can no longer treat the natural world as some kind of backdrop painted on, like on a stage that human beings act in front. This is changing us right now.
Here's a question from online that's connected to your comments that you just expressed. The last interview that we had on this program was with Natasha Romano from the NASA Goddard Institute, and she gave us a description of some of the latest climate science. She did remark at one point that we are definitely past the threshold, past the tipping point for at least one feedback, and that is Arctic ice melt. The question I thought of, or this person thought of, was if we're past that very major threshold, aren't we really past all thresholds? And I think this goes to the question about what are we doing when 15, 20 years ago people started saying, scientists started saying, David Suzuki started saying, we have 10 years left.
I'll come up there
and it's 20 years later. Are we past the point of really getting back to some previous state that is something that we're used to, and that's something that we can use the same socialist solutions to overcome? And if that is the case, what does that mean for ecosocialist theory and practice?
There is much debate among scientists, and I'm not an expert on Arctic ice. There is debate on where the tipping points occur, and it is certainly quite possible that we are past some tipping points. Certainly Arctic ice appears to be reached that point by just simple observation. On the other hand, but passing one tipping point is not the same as passing all of them. The loss of the Arctic ice is going to have a big effect on climate. It's going to have a big effect on animal life and numbers of others of impacts on us. But, for example, it does not appear that we have yet passed the tipping points for Greenland ice or for Antarctic ice. So these tipping points aren't necessarily coinciding. In some cases, we don't know what the tipping points are. For example, we are now producing artificially twice as much nitrogen as is produced naturally. Now, that's having a huge effect on, in particular, water-based life. But we don't actually know what the tipping point might be on that. So there's a whole set of the whole area of planetary boundaries have to be taken together. And one of the things we will have to deal with in this century is the fact of not just one tipping point, but of multiples starting to interact with each other. For example, quite possibly substantial addition, very probably in fact, of nitrogen to the water is going to increase loss of biodiversity. Loss of biodiversity is actually going to interfere with the oxygen levels in the atmosphere at some point. So we have all kinds of interacting things to deal with. In my view, we are certainly past the point where we can say that there is going to be more global warming. At what point a tipping point has occurred, or whether we've already passed them, is very hard to know. And I think part of the process of working towards socialism, the socialist movement, is going to have to start looking in its program at how it deals with the kind of world we will have if we do pass those tipping points. For example, one that we seem to be coming very close to in some countries is periods when it's so hot it's impossible to work outdoors. And we've seen that recently in India, we've seen it in Iran, and that is going to raise very big questions about distribution of population and how we're going to handle agriculture in big parts of the world. Those are things that we will have to confront as socialists.
Here's a question from Matt Andrews. Can you talk about the 4 planetary boundaries that have been crossed? I'm less familiar with land systems and biochemical flows. In what sense have boundaries been crossed as opposed to progressive deterioration?
Okay. You know, I saw that question getting typed in, and I'm sitting here thinking, I've got to look up my chart in the book. But what they have done with the planet, you have to understand how the planetary boundary system works. What they did not try when they were doing that to say this is the tipping point. Rather, what they said was, think of it like a guardrail on a mountain highway. You don't put the guardrail right at the edge of the road. You put it in from the road so that the cars won't get close enough to the cliff to fall over. And what they are trying to do in the planetary boundaries, and they've identified 9 of them that they believe are essential to maintaining conditions something like the Holocene, is to leave a safe space between the boundary and where you'd actually see a tipping point. So when they say they've passed the boundaries, it's important to realize that that's what they're talking about. They are not saying we are already over the edge. They are saying we're past the guardrail. We're very close to the edge, and they say this for various things: the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, biodiversity loss, and several others. And I'm sorry, this is really tiny print in my own chart, and I'm thinking I can't. If I read through that, I'll get something wrong here. But the things like, for example, deforestation, which is continuing proceeding at enormous rates, and they're trying to come up with estimates for that. And there's at least 2 of the boundaries that they have not even come up with a guesstimate yet. Some of them are just rough numbers, some of them are pretty precise, and some of them we don't even know yet what the point might be. And one of those that actually is quite frightening is the extent of pure and simple solid waste. Plastics and so on. We know that we are wrecking oceans and waters and so on, but we don't actually know what the tipping points might be. And at this point, there's huge research going on questions like that.
Okay, another question. You devoted a chapter on the ozone crisis and global response to it. Can you tell us about the relevance of that to the to other areas of environmental?
As I say, it's an entire chapter in the book, and I won't tie up all the time here with it. But fundamentally, the ozone layer is really a stunning example of what scientists mean when they say that humans are interfering with the great forces of nature. In the course of the last century, and even back in the 1800s, scientists learned that the ozone, which is a very rare gas that's high in the Earth's atmosphere, was playing a critical role in keeping the Earth safe because it was blocking and continues to block the most dangerous forms of ultraviolet rays, the ones that actually kill. And in the 1970s, pretty much in a series of accidents, scientists working in different fields discovered that the chemical, the chlorofluorocarbons, or CFCs, which were being used to run, that made refrigerators, that worked in spray cans and so on, that were generally viewed as completely harmless and totally safe. Nobody had any question about their safety. They discovered that those chemicals were in fact destroying the ozone. in the upper atmosphere. And by the time action was actually taken, the ozone layer over Antarctic, this is the famous hole in the ozone that we kept hearing about, we're starting to see 10 to 20% reductions, and it's impossible to generate completely accurate statistics, but it's quite certain that tens of thousands of cases of skin cancer have resulted from that loss in the ozone layer. It's interesting from our point of view now, first of all, because number one, it shows what it means that human beings can overpower a great force. Most of us would never even imagine that a few ozone molecules were a great force, but they were in fact keeping this Earth and are keeping this Earth habitable. But it also, if you look at the history of it, the manufacturers of ozone went into full-out denial, just like the climate deniers do today and like the tobacco folks did before, saying we don't have enough research, we have to study it some more.
And the question is, why is this guy singing in the subway? He's got a beautiful voice, you know? Surprising.
And I don't know who just said I had a beautiful voice with the subway.
In New York, nobody.
Great. No, I can't hear you, Brad.
Oh, okay. So whoever's out there, can you please mute while Ian Angus is talking? Thank you. Thank you.
Anyway, the point is that the manufacturers of CFCs resisted any action, and the only reason we got action was basically two things. One of them was DuPont, which was the biggest manufacturer, figured out a profitable way to replace CFCs with other chemicals, and they figured they'd have an edge over all their competitors. So number one, you had a major corporation that was willing to take action because they could make money at it. And number two, the treaty that dealt with it didn't get into let's do CFC cap and trade, or let's do CFC markets, or any of that sort of thing. They simply banned it. And although CFCs are still being produced for some purposes, basically production has radically dropped. And I think it's a very important indication of how you deal with this kind of problem. That if we've been waiting for the market to solve the CFC problem, we'd probably have the ozone layer be gone by now.
Okay, we have about 10 minutes left. How are you doing, Ian? We're grilling you with a lot of questions. Are you doing all right?
I'm doing fine.
Okay, here's a question from Crosser. Sorry if I didn't pronounce it right. Given the different reality we have to face with the passing of planetary boundaries, and what you just said, Ian, what role does prefiguration play in dealing with this? As far as you are aware, are ecosocialists engaged in setting up some ways of building the new?
That's a good question. Number one, I think anyone who's an ecosocialist, in fact, anyone who isn't, should walk as lightly on the earth as they possibly can. Should find all possible ways to do as little damage individually. And I certainly think that I know of ecosocialists who are engaged in various projects, certainly to fight to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the areas where they live or against specific projects. But I do think that the scale of this problem is such that it is not going to be solved by individuals changing their behavior. So long as, well, I live in Canada, and I live in a town where the Energy East pipeline is, if it's built, is going to be carrying a 1.5 million, millions of barrels of bitumen, tar sands oil through it, and stopping that pipeline project will have more impact than everybody together deciding to ride their bicycles. So I think that while I'm in favor of anything anybody can do to reduce their impact on the earth, the key actually is on the larger scale of social and economic change to leave the oil in the soil, leave the coal in the hole.
My own experience is that the range of tactics and the range of projects that our ecosocialists are involved with is immense. And the idea for us in building a movement is to bring all those different segments of the movement together. So, for instance, the transition movement, it's political in its own way, but it isn't explicitly political and doesn't tend to, at least in my area of the world, doesn't tend to get involved in the direct action or advocacy. But those connections really need to be made for us to build this movement. Here's another question from someone named Jay. Here we go. Dr. James Hansen states that he believes the answer is gradually increasing the carbon fee, with 100% of the fees returned to American households on a per-person basis, as proposed by the Citizens Climate Lobby.org. Where do ecosocialists stand on this proposal? Hansen so strongly believes that he joined the advisory board of the CCL.
I think Hansen has taken, within the context of the kinds of approaches that are available to him, he is not a socialist. I think his carbon fee is a quite brilliant concept. It is not what we think of as carbon tax. It is a fee levied at the point of production, and its purpose is to make it very expensive to take oil out of the ground, or coal out of the ground, or to import it. It's a way that a single country, for example, can take action without, by simply forcing, simply radically driving up the cost of production to the corporations involved. It's not a solution in itself. And if you look at Hansen's papers on this, he always links it to other things, including direct policies to reduce production of fossil fuels. And I think would have to be put together with that. I think it is significantly superior to any of the cap and trade or carbon tax models we typically see from green parties, and is worth supporting on that basis. So on that basis, as I say, I don't think it's a solution in and of itself, but I think it's a positive step, and it's also, again, back to a discussion we had a little bit earlier, an example of a scientist trying to come to grips with how to impose, how to actually make change, as opposed to simply announcing here's the current level of CO2, and that is a process that we should definitely encourage.
There's a couple questions here from Howard, who asked these before. I think you answered the last question. John Bellamy Foster is in favor of carbon tax. What is your opinion? Foster has also written about 2 stages of development. Is that term familiar to you?
On the I work very closely with John Bellamy Foster, and I'm a big fan of his work. That doesn't mean we always agree, or even that I've read everything that he's written, because he's incredibly prolific. So I don't comment very well. But he does talk in terms of, as I was saying earlier, that we are in a situation where we have to build a movement that can fight to reduce emissions as much as we can in the near term, as a process towards, as I said earlier, number one, staving off capitalism, slowing the destruction down. I mean, it is not impossible to make capitalism and capitalist governments can be forced into action even against their will if there's enough support and if we can build mass movements. And I think that's important. The other thing I would say is that building a socialist movement depends on that. As I say, I think in my book, if we can't stop fracking or stop a university from investing in fossil fuels, what on earth makes us think we can arrange a socialist revolution? Building a movement involves an awful lot of tasks, and as you say, eco-socialists are involved in a great many of them in different ways.
Okay, this question from Bill. Ian, I think you object to social constructionists for downplaying biophysical relationships in favor of the social determinants. Pardon the crude formation of this question, says Bill, but can you say what your experience has been when interacting with generally positivist physical scientists, given that you are a socialist?
Okay, that was a complex question.
I might have a follow-up question to that, but go ahead.
Let me start off with, there are, within the whole field of the sociology of science, there are a whole range of opinions. The social constructivists who basically believe that science is pretty much a matter, in the extreme version, they would argue that science is a matter of opinion. And obviously, I am probably not going to run into such people campaigning to reduce carbon emissions if they think it's just a matter of opinion. But within there's opportunities to where I work with people who have all kinds of differences with me on methods of analysis, on underlying philosophy. I work on a quite regular basis with fundamentalist Christians who are eager to protect God's earth, and their analysis of the problem is very different than mine, but we can come to common ground on programmatic issues, and that's what I think we have to focus our attention on. Then we can, within that framework, have discussions of how we think the changes are occurring, what changes are occurring, and why they're occurring.
One last question here, and then if you can answer, then I'll wrap up. From Howard again. It's about the urgency of the situation. What do we have time to do? Are there 19th century revolutionary socialist solution? Are there any politically viable solution politically viable in the wide sense or in the narrow electoral sense to where we are going, and what the climate science says?
Well, you know, I do tacked up over my desk here the Gramsci's pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. The last thing I want to do is understate the level of the problem that we face. It is huge. And organizing to change is an equally huge task. On the other hand, the alternative is to give up. You know, if we, as I've said on many occasions, if we fight, we might lose. If we don't fight, we're definitely going to lose. So, yeah, we make the effort we can, as much as we can. Now, having, you know, that is a sort of pessimistic kind of sounding thing. If you had told me 2 years ago that a person who calls himself a socialist would come as close to as Bernie Sanders has to the nomination of the Democratic Party, I would have laughed at you. We may have different opinions of Sanders politics, I'm sure we do, but the simple existence of the Sanders phenomenon tells us that the world can change and that people can look towards the kinds of ideas that we have in a serious way. So I don't think we need to be intensely pessimistic about this. That doesn't mean our optimism is not a foolish, everything's going to be okay hope. It's a solidly based, people can change the world, people have changed the world, and the need for people to change the world is no greater than it's ever, so let's get to work.
Okay, just a few comments. Firstly, I'd like to encourage those who are interested to be part of the network. There's no paid organizers. There's not a lot of structure to this network. There's a lot of individuals all across the US and in Canada, and people who correspond in other parts of the world with us. It's an exciting group. There's local conferences every once in a while. There's some really key star theorists and activists out there. For me, it was very, very important to find a group not immobilized by the immensity and the depths of the crisis and the theory of how hard it is to change everything. This was a group that uses theory and drills analytically into the problem deeper and deeper to become empowered to take on a political approach to organizing rather than a siloed kind of individualist approach that we've seen too often with neoliberalism. So anyway, I don't know if that made sense to everybody, but I encourage everybody to be part of it. Send an email to info@systemchange.climatechange.org if you'd like to become part of our listserv. And finally, I'd like to thank Ian Angus for this interview. Not only this interview, but for his many, many years and decades of dedication to this movement and earlier movements. You can see it in his life's work. He's written many books. You can see it on Climate Capitalism, which is the climatecapitalism.com, which is the source for all the leading dialogues, debates, information that connects capitalism and climate issues. So thank you very much, Ian, for your work, and really appreciate your time. Everybody else, look for the next message for about a month's time. We'll have another star interviewee to interview. And good night to all.
Can I just jump in, Brad, very quickly on a selfish basis and remind people about my book, Facing the Anthropocene. It's from Monthly Review Press. It's available from them by mail now if you order from their website. And on July 1, it will be available in North America from all the major online sources. I believe it's already available in Australia, and it should be available in Europe very soon.
Okay, thank you. Good night, Ian.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.